At 72, I handed over the keys to the house I had lived in for 40 years, convinced that moving into my son's spare bedroom was the greatest gift a father could give. 14 months later, I found myself standing in their hallway at 11 at night, holding my breath so the floorboards wouldn't creak, while my daughter-in-law cried softly in the kitchen. I was not supposed to hear her. I had only walked down the hall to get a glass of water, moving in my socks along the carpet runner. But when I reached the top of the stairs, the low murmur of voices floated up from below. "David, I love your father," Sarah was whispering, her voice cracked with an exhaustion that goes far deeper than a long day at work. "I really do, but I feel like a stranger in my own kitchen. I can't even make breakfast in my robe anymore. Every time I turn around, he's just waiting. I feel so guilty, but I can't live like this for the next 10 years. My son David did not defend me. He didn't argue with her, nor did he raise his voice. He simply let out a long, ragged sigh that sounded heavier than a sack of concrete. "I know, honey," David replied quietly. "I know, but what else am I supposed to do? He's my dad. He has nowhere else to go." I stood frozen in the dark. The glass in my hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. For 40 years, I had been an estimator for industrial heating and cooling systems. My entire career was built on precise measurements. I knew how to calculate airflow, thermal loss, and the exact capacity of structural spaces. But standing in that hallway, I realized I had completely miscalculated the emotional square footage of my son's life. I quietly turned around and walked back to the guest bedroom. I closed the door without letting the latch click, sat on the edge of the twin mattress, and stared at my slippers in the dark. How had a father with good intentions ended up becoming an emotional burden in his own son's home? To understand that night, you have to understand the silence that came before it. 4 years earlier, cancer took my wife, Evelyn. We had been married for 44 years in a sturdy 3-bedroom brick house in Columbus, Ohio. When you lose a spouse of 4 decades, people talk about the grief, but they rarely mention the noise of the quiet. The quiet after a long marriage is not peaceful. It is loud. It echoes off the baseboards. It sits beside you while the coffee pot brews. My 3-bedroom house, once filled with the clatter of lawnmowers, school projects, and Evelyn's sewing machine, became a museum of things that no longer moved. I would sit in the den at 4 in the afternoon and realize I hadn't spoken a single word out loud all day. David lived 6 hours away in the suburbs of Chicago with Sarah and our 2 grandsons, Leo and Toby. He called every Sunday at 6 o'clock sharp. Those calls were the highlight of my week, but they always ended the same way. "How are you holding up, Dad?" David would ask, his voice carrying the faint background sounds of his boys laughing and dinner sizzling on the stove. "Doing fine, son," I would always answer, "just tinkering around." It was a lie. I was surviving, not living. When David visited for Evelyn's memorial service, he looked around the big yard and the empty rooms. During our last breakfast together before he drove back to Illinois, he put his fork down and leaned across the table. "Dad, sell the place," he said earnestly. "Come live with us. We have that big finished room over the garage. The boys would love having their grandpa around, and you wouldn't have to shovel snow or worry about fixing the roof anymore. We're family. We belong together." In that moment, his words sounded like salvation. For men of my generation, family was supposed to gather together when life got hard. In my mind, multi-generational households were the traditional, honorable way to grow old. I believed that love meant closeness, and closeness meant sharing a roof. I sold my house within 2 months. I gave away half my furniture, sold my lawn tractor, and packed my clothes, my old drafting tools, and Evelyn's favorite mantel clock into a rental truck. I gave David $40,000 from the sale to help upgrade the guest bathroom and put new carpeting in the room over the garage. I felt proud. I wasn't just moving in. I was contributing. I told myself I was stepping into the golden years, surrounded by the warmth of my children and grandchildren. The first month felt like a prolonged holiday. Every evening I sat at the head of the dinner table. Leo, who was 11 then, showed me his science projects, and Toby, who was 8, begged me to tell stories about when his dad was a boy. Sarah made pot roast, and David and I had a beer on the back patio after dinner. I thought I had solved the great puzzle of aging. I felt useful, loved, and insulated from the bitter winter of loneliness. Then, real life resumed. The problem with a guest room is that, eventually, you realize you are still a guest, and a guest is someone who has no natural rhythm in the house. I had been waking up at 5:30 in the morning for 50 years. When you work in mechanical contracting, early mornings are in your blood. At home in Columbus, I would make a full pot of strong black coffee, turn on the kitchen radio, and read the paper. In David's house, turning on a faucet downstairs sounded like a waterfall through the ceiling of their master bedroom directly below the kitchen. The first time I made coffee at 5:45 a.m., the electric grinder woke Sarah. She came down 15 minutes later, her hair tied in a messy bun, wearing a polite but strained smile. "Good morning, Arthur," she said, wrapping her cardigan tight around herself. "You're up early." "Habit of a lifetime, Sarah," I said cheerfully. "Pot's fresh." "Thank you," she replied softly. "Just maybe use the pre-ground coffee on weekdays." The grinder vibrates right through the floorboards above the headboard. "Of course," I said, feeling a slight sting of embarrassment. "Sorry about that." It was a small thing, a reasonable request. But it was the first pebble in what soon became a landslide of unspoken adjustments. I tried to be helpful. That was my biggest mistake. When an older man loses his authority over his own life, he often tries to manufacture usefulness. One Tuesday afternoon, while everyone was out at school and work, I noticed David's garage was in complete disarray. Lawn tools leaned against bicycles, extension cords hung in tangled knots, and his workbench was buried under paint cans and half-finished projects. For 40 years, my garage had been organized down to the 16th of an inch. Every wrench had a traced outline on the pegboard. I spent 4 hours sweeping, sorting, building a small lumber rack, and organizing his hand tools into labeled bins. I stepped back at 4:30 p.m., wiping the sweat from my brow, feeling the first real burst of pride I had felt in months. When David pulled into the driveway, I was standing there, expecting him to be thrilled. He got out of his car carrying his laptop bag. He looked at the spotless workbench, the rearranged shelves, and the new pegboard layout. His face didn't light up. It tightened. "Dad," he said, his voice clipped, "where did you put my metric sockets?" "They're in the red cabinet on the second shelf, grouped by size," I explained proudly. "Everything was scattered, so I sorted them out for you." David dropped his bag on the steps leading into the house and rubbed the back of his neck. "Dad, I appreciate you trying to help," he said, trying to keep his temper in check. "But I knew where everything was in my mess. This is my workshop. You don't need to reorganize my things." "I was just trying to save you some time, son," I said, my voice dropping. "I know," David sighed, looking away. "Just, please ask me first next time." He went inside and let the door shut behind him. I stood alone in the clean garage. The smell of sawdust and engine oil suddenly felt completely alien. I realized with a cold, hollow certainty that this wasn't my workshop. It was his, and no amount of organizing would make me the master of that house again. Over the next few months, the boundaries of my world began to shrink. I stopped offering to fix leaky faucets because David preferred to call a local plumber he trusted. I stopped suggesting recipes for Sunday dinners because Sarah had a structured meal plan for the boys' sports schedules. I even stopped watching the evening news in the family room because Leo and Toby needed that space for homework and video games before bed. Instead, I spent more and more of my days sitting in the room over the garage. I would read paperbacks until the print blurred. I would look out the window at the neighbor across the street mowing his lawn, wishing I had grass of my own to cut. When you live in someone else's home, you become acutely aware of every sound you make. You close cabinet doors with extreme care. You flush the toilet only when absolutely necessary during the night. You check the hallway before walking out to make sure you aren't interrupting a private conversation. I had traded the empty quiet of Columbus for a crowded silence in Chicago. The worst part was the politeness. Nobody was cruel. Sarah never raised her voice at me. David never told me I wasn't welcome. But they treated me with the careful, exhausting courtesy people reserved for long-term house guests who have overstayed their visit. Every dinner conversation began to feel like a performance. "How was your day, Arthur?" Sarah would ask. "Fine, just read a bit," I'd reply. "Did you get out for a walk?" David would chime in. "Just around the block." Then silence would fall, filled only by the scrape of silverware against ceramic plates. I wanted to contribute to the household expenses, but every time I tried to hand Sarah a check for groceries, she would push it back across the table with a flustered look. "Arthur, please, we don't want your money," she would say. "You're David's father." She meant it as an act of respect, but to me it felt like charity. It reminded me every single day that I was dependent on them for food, shelter, and hot water. I was no longer a provider, an advisor, or an anchor. I was a dependent. And then came that night in the dark hallway. Hearing Sarah weep and hearing David's helpless exhaustion shattered the last illusion I had been clinging to. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I sat in the chair by the window until the sky shifted from pitch black to a bruised gray. My initial reaction was anger and wounded pride. After everything I gave to raise David, after helping them with the house, this is how they feel? Am I so intolerable that my own family can't stand having me in the next room? I wanted to pack my bags right then, call a taxi, and leave a bitter note on the kitchen counter. I wanted them to feel guilty for failing me. But as the morning sun began to hit the maple trees in the yard, Evelyn's voice came back to me. Evelyn had always been the perceptive one. Whenever I got stubborn about family matters, she would put her hand on my arm and say, "Arthur, take a step back and look at the whole blueprint, not just your own corner." I forced myself to look at the blueprint of that house honestly. David was 42 years old. He was in the prime of his career, carrying the weight of a mortgage, 2 growing boys, and a marriage that needed space to breathe. Sarah worked 40 hours a week managing corporate audits and came home to manage a household. They weren't trying to push me away because they didn't love me. They were struggling because a marriage is designed for 2 people, not 3. By inserting myself into their daily life, I hadn't brought the family closer together. I had put their lives on hold. I had forced my daughter-in-law to walk on eggshells in her own sanctuary, and I had put my son in an impossible position between his duty as a son and his duty as a husband. I had believed that living together was proof of love. In truth, it was an act of emotional cowardice. I had moved in with them not because they needed me, but because I was terrified of facing the silence of my own grief alone. I had made my fear of loneliness their responsibility to manage. That morning, when I walked downstairs at 7:30 a.m., after the boys had left for school, Sarah was wiping down the island counter. She looked tired, with faint shadows beneath her eyes. "Morning, Arthur," she said, giving me that familiar, careful smile. "Coffee's in the pot." "Thank you, Sarah," I said gently. I poured a cup, took a deep breath, and sat down at the kitchen table. "Sarah," I said, keeping my voice steady and warm, "I'd like to ask you for a favor." She turned around, looking slightly guarded. "Sure. What is it?" "I've been thinking for a while now," I lied smoothly, "that I've gotten far too lazy up in that spare room. I miss having my own kitchen where I can make a mess and burn toast at 6 in the morning without waking anyone up. I want to look at some small one-bedroom apartments nearby. Could you help me look online today? Sarah stopped wiping the counter. Her hands stayed still on the cloth for 3 long seconds. When she looked up at me, the tension in her shoulders dropped so visibly it was as if she had set down a 100-pound backpack. But right behind that relief came a wave of deep embarrassment. "Arthur, did we do something wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "David and I want you here. You don't have to leave." "You didn't do anything wrong, Sarah," I said, and for the first time in 14 months I meant every single word. "You've been remarkably kind to an old man who didn't know how to be alone. But David needs his wife, the boys need their parents, and quite frankly, I need my independence back. A grandfather is much more fun when he comes to visit than when he's sitting in the living room waiting for dinner." She walked over to the table, sat down across from me, and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were full of tears. They weren't tears of frustration anymore. They were tears of genuine gratitude. When David came home that evening, Sarah had already told him. He came straight up to my room. He closed the door behind him, looking pale and conflicted. "Dad, what is this about an apartment?" he demanded, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you unhappy here? Did Sarah say something to you?" "Nobody said anything to me, David," I said calmly. "Sit down." He sat on the edge of the twin bed, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. "Look at me, son," I said. "When you invited me to live here, you did it out of love. It was the most generous thing a son could ever do for his father. But a grown man needs his own front door. He needs his own keys. When I lived in Columbus, I was a man managing his own life. Since I moved in here, I've turned into an old fellow waiting around for instructions."
"Dad, I can do better," David argued, his voice cracking. "I can spend more time with you. We can go fishing on weekends."
"David, stop," I interrupted him softly. "You don't need to fix this. There is nothing broken between us. But your job right now is to build a life for Leo and Toby, and to be a partner to Sarah. My job is to finish my own life with my head held high. Moving into an apartment 10 minutes down the road isn't abandoning each other. It's giving each other permission to be a family again." David looked down at the floor for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, but the defensive tightness in his jaw was gone. "Are you sure, Dad?" he whispered. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," I told him. 2 weeks later, we found a sunny, third-floor, one-bedroom apartment in a quiet complex just 3 miles away. It had large windows that faced a small courtyard with old willow trees, a tiny kitchen with clean linoleum, and just enough room for my drafting table, a comfortable armchair, and my bed. The day we moved my things out was completely different from the day I had arrived in Chicago. There were no awkward apologies or forced smiles. David, Leo, and Toby helped me carry my boxes up the stairs. Leo helped me set up my television, and Toby insisted on testing every single kitchen cabinet to make sure they opened properly. Before they left that afternoon, Sarah handed me a housewarming gift. It was a brand new electric coffee grinder, wrapped in blue paper, with a card that read, "To Arthur, grind your coffee as early and as loud as you want. We love you." That first night in the apartment, I sat in my old armchair by the window. The apartment was completely silent. There were no children running upstairs, no muted television playing in another room, and no dinner smells drifting through the vents. For the first 20 minutes, that old, familiar wave of loneliness threatened to wash over me. The quiet was there, waiting for me. But this time, the quiet didn't feel heavy. It felt clean. It was my space. If I wanted to leave a book on the table, it stayed there. If I wanted to get up at 5 in the morning and listen to the radio while drinking coffee, nobody was disturbed. I wasn't an inconvenience. I wasn't a project to be managed. I was Arthur Miller, master of 650 square feet of peace. The transformation in our family over the next year was extraordinary. Instead of seeing me every day out of obligation, my family began seeing me out of genuine desire. I instituted a new rule. Sunday dinners would happen at their house, but only when invited. And every other Tuesday, the boys would ride their bikes over to my apartment after school for ice cream and homework help before David picked them up on his way home from work. When I arrived at David's house on Sundays, I was no longer a shadow sitting in the corner of their kitchen. I was Grandpa. Leo would run to the door to show me his newest drawings. Toby would drag me to the backyard to throw a baseball. Sarah would greet me with a warm, relaxed hug, and David and I would stand by the grill, drinking a beer, talking about our weeks like two grown men who respected each other's lives. Our conversations were no longer shallow scripts designed to avoid stepping on each other's toes. Because we had physical distance, we finally had emotional room to be close. I am 74 now. Sometimes people at the senior center ask me why I don't move in with my son. They say, at our age, why waste money on rent when your children have a spare room? I always smile, take a sip of my coffee, and tell them the truth. When you get older, your instincts tell you to hold on tighter to the people you love. You fear that if you let go of their daily presence, you will lose your place in their hearts. You tell yourself that living under one roof is the ultimate expression of family loyalty. It took me 72 years and a year of living in a guest bedroom to understand that love doesn't require sharing a hallway. Adult children need their own territory to fight, laugh, make mistakes, and raise their own young, without an older generation watching from the sidelines. And an aging parent needs the dignity of their own front door far more than they need the convenience of a free room. A smaller apartment of your own will always hold more dignity, freedom, and peace than the largest spare bedroom in your child's house. Moving out didn't make me less of a father. It gave my son his family back, and it gave me my self-respect back. Most mornings now, I wake up at 5:30. I turn on my loud coffee grinder without hesitation. I brew a fresh, strong pot, take my mug, and step out onto my small third-floor balcony. The morning air is crisp. The willow trees below sway gently in the early breeze. I take a sip of hot coffee, listen to the distant hum of the awakening city, and smile. I am alone in this apartment, but I am no longer lonely. There is a profound difference between the two, and it took me a lifetime to finally learn it. If you've ever had to make a difficult choice about holding on to your independence or setting boundaries with the people you love most, I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. Hearing how others have navigated these later chapters of life is always a comfort. And if this story brought a bit of clarity or peace to your day, please give the video a like and consider subscribing to join us for the next reflection. Until then, take good care of yourself and protect the quiet dignity of your own life.